Not everything that's repeated becomes true. Some stories gain traction not because they're real, but because they work. They stir fear, outrage, or curiosity. Over time, they stop being just rumors and turn into unquestionable truths, etched into our collective memory, as if they were events we all lived through, even if they never actually happened. Today, we're going to explore a few of those stories, and by the end, you might realize that the version we remember isn't always the one that really happened. The Rite of Prima Nocte. Imagine the following scenario. A young peasant woman, about to be married, is forced to spend her wedding night with the local feudal lord while her groom waits helplessly. This image has been portrayed in films, plays, and books as a symbol of the absolute oppression of medieval nobility. The concept, known as the Rite of Prima Nocte, or Droit du Seigneur, has become one of the darkest emblems of the Middle Ages. But, did it actually happen? Despite its powerful symbolism and narrative appeal, the answer is probably not. Most historians agree that this so-called rite was never an institutionalized practice. To this day, there is no legal record, ecclesiastical document, or official evidence that proves such a privilege existed among the feudal nobility. In other words, if it ever did happen, it was completely outside the norm, an isolated abuse, not a systemic rule. The earliest reference to anything similar appears in the 9th century biography of Saint Gerald of Aurillac, where a noble attempts to exercise this rite, but is stopped by a miracle. That alone suggests the practice wasn't socially accepted or sanctioned. If it had been common, no miracle would have been needed to stop it, right? So the question becomes, where did this story come from? The answer lies in the centuries that followed, particularly during the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. Critics of the feudal system and the Catholic Church used this narrative as a rhetorical weapon. Accusing feudal lords of such acts helped reinforce the idea that the medieval system was brutal, corrupt, and decadent. It was an effective way to paint the Catholic past as dark, the perfect contrast to highlight the rising modern and Protestant ideals. Over time, the fable solidified. The myth became a powerful metaphor for inequality, domination, and abuse. Its dramatic weight was so strong that the truth hardly mattered. After all, popular culture loves a good villain, and the oppressive feudal lord fit the role perfectly. This is a clear example of how history can be manipulated to serve political or ideological agendas. When a myth aligns with the values or emotions of an era, it gains strength. Even without a factual basis, it becomes truth, not in history books, but in collective memory. The Iron Maiden. When we think of medieval torture, it's almost automatic to picture that bizarre contraption, an iron capsule shaped like a human body, lined with spikes on the inside, slowly closing in on a helpless victim. The infamous Iron Maiden. The name alone is terrifying, and the image, even more so. It became the ultimate symbol of medieval cruelty. But what if I told you it never actually existed? That's right. The truth is, the Iron Maiden was a 19th century invention. To be precise, it was created in 1808, long after the Middle Ages had ended. There is no document, no record, no eyewitness account, and no archaeological evidence that confirms the use of such a device before that. No mention in medieval court records, no authentic artifacts. What we see today in museums? Replicas. Replicas designed to shock, entertain, and above all, sell a distorted image of an entire era. The myth was fueled largely by the 19th century fascination with the Gothic, the macabre, with castles and dungeons. It was the age of horror stories, romantic literature, and the first public exhibitions of historical curiosities. The Iron Maiden fit perfectly into that imagination. Brutal, mysterious, theatrical, a flawless prop to feed the fantasy that the Middle Ages were an age of utter darkness. But the truth is, although torture did exist, it didn't have that Hollywood-style sophistication. Real instruments like the rack, the wheel, or the pulley were indeed horrifying, but also simpler, more direct, more real. The Iron Maiden was far too complex for the standards of the time, and its mechanics would have required a level of precision technology that simply didn't exist in the medieval period. And this phenomenon isn't exclusive to the Iron Maiden. Other torture staples of popular imagination, like the infamous swinging blade, were also invented or dramatized much later, often in works of fiction or sensationalist museum displays. The case of the Iron Maiden reveals something deep about how we perceive the past. We tend to believe that anything that looks medieval must be medieval. If it fits the popular image, it must be true. And it's exactly this kind of thinking that fuels historical myths, turning modern inventions into facts that shape how we see entire centuries. More than just a torture device, the Iron Maiden is a lesson in how history is written, and sometimes rewritten, with blood, iron, and a whole lot of imagination. The Sex of Angels and the Fall of Constantinople. Picture a city on the brink of collapse. Enemies at the gates, armies advancing, chaos taking over, and, according to legend, Byzantine theologians were busy debating the sex of angels. Absurd, right? Yet this image gained traction and became a symbol of the supposed detachment of the medieval church from the real world. The problem is, it never actually happened. This narrative is nothing more than a satire invented in the 17th century, long after Constantinople fell in 1453, created to mock scholasticism and medieval theology. Its most likely origin? Protestant writers, in the midst of the Reformation, who used caricatures like this to attack Catholic intellectualism. The idea was to portray religious scholars as wasting time on pointless, ridiculous debates while the real world crumbled around them. But historical records tell a different story. During the Ottoman siege, the Byzantine resistance was heroic. Despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage, the city's defenders fought to the very end. Emperor Constantine XI died in battle. The city fell after weeks of intense siege, not because of philosophical negligence. Of course, theological debates did exist. St. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, centuries earlier, had written about angels and their relation to space. But those were exercises in logic and systematic thought, not delusional distractions, and they certainly weren't happening during battle. Saying that theologians were discussing the sex of angels while the city burned is as absurd as claiming firefighters discuss Shakespeare during a fire. This story illustrates how certain myths spread not because they're true, but because they're rhetorically powerful. The image of bearded men in robes ignoring war to debate trivialities is striking. It makes people laugh, it shocks, and it reinforces the idea that the medieval church was out of touch with reality. That's what makes it effective and dangerous. The myth also serves a clear ideological purpose: to delegitimize scholastic thought and, by extension, the Catholic Church's authority over knowledge. In an era when new philosophical and scientific ideas were emerging, mocking the past became a convenient shortcut. In the end, the debate over the sex of angels tells us far more about the people who invented the joke than about those supposedly having it. And it reminds us of a crucial truth: laughter, when used as a weapon, can rewrite history, even when it's based on pure fiction. Flat Earth and the myth of medieval ignorance. Few ideas are as widespread and as mistaken as the belief that everyone in the Middle Ages thought the Earth was flat. This view, usually accompanied by the image of Christopher Columbus sailing into a sea of skeptics, became a powerful symbol of the clash between science and ignorance. But what if I told you that, in reality, almost no one believed that? Since ancient Greece, philosophers and mathematicians already knew the Earth was round. Parmenides, Plato, and Aristotle all referred to the planet's spherical shape. And in the 3rd century BCE, Eratosthenes not only knew this, he calculated the Earth's circumference with surprising accuracy using nothing but shadows and simple math. In the Middle Ages, this knowledge was preserved, especially within the church itself. Priests, monks, scholars, and educated navigators were fully aware they lived on a globe. Need proof? Numerous medieval maps, though geographically flawed, depicted the Earth as a sphere. At medieval universities, this was an accepted and taught truth. So where did the myth of the medieval flat Earth come from? The answer lies in the 19th century. Writers like Washington Irving, in their romanticized biographies of Columbus, portrayed his journey as a fight against the church's ignorance. This created a heroic narrative, the man of science defying religious obscurantism. Sounds epic, right? Too bad it's fiction. Enlightenment thinkers and later modern authors also helped spread this false idea. Criticizing the Middle Ages was a way to glorify their own era. The darker the past seemed, the brighter the present shone. And few myths were as effective as the image of an entire civilization believing the world ended in an abyss. The truth is, during Columbus's time, the debate wasn't about whether the Earth was flat or round, but about how big it was. Columbus believed the Indies were just around the Atlantic's corner. Scholars, however, correctly argued the journey would be much longer than he imagined, and they were right. If the Americas hadn't been in the way, he likely would have starved at sea. This story is a harsh reminder of how history can be rewritten to fit an agenda. The myth of the medieval flat Earth became a symbol of backwardness, not because it was true, but because it was useful. It served as a simple and powerful way to criticize religion, promote progress, and create heroes, even if they weren't fighting the battle we think they were. Cervantes and the myth of the lost hand. Miguel de Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote, is one of the most iconic figures in world literature, and with that fame came the stories, including the claim that he lost his left hand at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. This version earned him the nickname, the One-Handed Man of Lepanto, and helped cement the image of a war hero mutilated in battle. But did he really lose his hand? The truth is, he didn't. Cervantes was shot by an arquebus during the battle, and his left hand was permanently paralyzed. That means it lost functionality, not that it was amputated. In the 17th century, the term moneda didn't necessarily mean someone without a hand. It referred to anyone with impaired mobility in the hand or arm. The confusion arose centuries later when the meaning of the word shifted. Over time, it came to be understood more literally, someone missing a hand. And so, the image of Cervantes as a warrior who sacrificed a limb on the battlefield gained traction, feeding both myth and public admiration. But this error reveals something deeper than just a translation slip. It shows how language evolves, and how, if we don't understand the original meaning of words within their historical context, we can completely distort the facts. That's why fields like philology and historical linguistics are so crucial for serious historical research. In this particular case, the myth also fit neatly into the tragic hero archetype, a writer who lived in poverty, endured imprisonment, and bore on his body the marks of a naval battle. Sounds like he stepped out of one of his own novels, right? A full-blown mutilation, though false, was more dramatic, more marketable. What's curious is that Cervantes's real life was already dramatic enough. He survived severe wounds, spent years as a prisoner in Algiers, and led a life full of upheaval. He didn't need embellishments to be legendary, but the collective imagination loves a good scar, preferably one involving the literal loss of a limb in the name of honor. The Black Legend of the Spanish Conquest. When we talk about the Spanish conquest of the Americas, it almost automatically conjures images of bloodshed, violence, and unrelenting brutality. One of the most striking and disturbing elements of this narrative is the idea that conquistadors systematically raped indigenous women, as if it were an institutionalized and universal practice. This nightmare scenario became central to what is known as the Black Legend. But while this image contains real elements of violence and domination, it is also a distortion crafted with very specific goals. Historians acknowledge that, yes, rape and abuse occurred, as they do in nearly every war and colonial enterprise. However, the notion that every interaction between Spaniards and indigenous peoples boiled down to this extreme violence ignores the historical complexity of the conquest. Contemporary accounts, including those from Spanish chroniclers, report that many indigenous women voluntarily accompanied the conquistadors, sometimes even leaving behind native husbands. Why? Political alliances, a search for protection, the promise of social mobility, or even personal relationships formed amidst the chaos of conquest. There were marriages, strategic unions, and the birth of a new mestizo society. La Malinche herself, a central historical figure in the conquest of Mexico, is a prime example. She was an interpreter, advisor, and companion to Hernán Cortés, reducing all indigenous women to passive victims in a singular narrative of brutality ironically erases their agency and complexity. So why did this myth spread? The answer lies in politics. The Black Legend was fueled by Spain's enemies, England, the Netherlands, and other rivals, who sought to portray the Spaniards as bloodthirsty monsters and justify their own colonial actions as more civilized. Later, the same discourse was adopted by independence movements in Latin America, which needed to demonize Spain to forge new national identities. In other words, the narrative of systematic rape was less about what truly happened, and more about constructing a useful historical villain. The lesson here is clear. History is often a battleground of competing versions, where facts and myths blend to serve ideological agendas. And when an image carries emotional weight, like that of a violated woman, it takes root, even if it ignores more nuanced realities. Acknowledging this doesn't mean denying the horrors of the conquest, but rather looking at them with greater depth, because real history rarely fits into a single label, and Indigenous women, so often seen only as victims, were also protagonists, even within a deeply tragic context. Van Gogh and the myth of the severed ear. Few episodes are as iconic as the one in which Vincent van Gogh, supposedly in a fit of madness, cuts off his own ear after a heated argument with fellow painter Paul Gauguin. This moment, repeated in films, biographies, and even cartoons, helped cement the image of the tormented genius, a man who, consumed by insanity, turned pain into his palette. But, is that really what happened? According to new evidence, maybe not. German researchers Hans Kaufmann and Rita Wildegens reviewed documents from the time, including police records and letters exchanged between the artists, and proposed a very different version. The injury, it seems, was actually caused by Gauguin. During a violent argument, he struck Van Gogh with a sword, slicing off part of his left earlobe. Van Gogh, in a gesture of loyalty, or perhaps guilt, may have fabricated the story of self-mutilation to protect his friend. The official narrative, however, went a different route. The image of Van Gogh as a tragic, brilliant artist who cuts off his own ear in a moment of despair was far more powerful and more marketable. It fit perfectly into the archetype of the mad artist, someone so overwhelmed by emotional intensity that he crosses the boundaries of reason. This version also allowed critics and the public to draw a direct line between suffering and art. The severed ear became a symbol, and that symbol, in turn, overshadowed the facts. Because let's face it, it's not very poetic to say that a drunken brawl between two artists ended with a poorly aimed sword strike. But the myth reveals something deeper. How our craving for dramatic, tragic, and beautifully painful stories can completely rewrite the truth. The portrayal of a self-destructive Van Gogh served a narrative that romanticized suffering as a key ingredient of genius. It was more convenient to believe in a moment of creative madness than in a case of plain old violence. Van Gogh's ear is a textbook example of how biographies can turn into myths, and how those myths become widely accepted facts. And perhaps the most fascinating part is realizing that, even with new evidence, many people still prefer the classic version, because it's more tragic, more symbolic, easier to digest. In the end, Van Gogh's art survives regardless of the truth or lies behind his ear. But the episode shows just how far we're willing to bend facts in favor of a good story, even if that story was written in blood or paint. The Water Boy and the Discovery of Tutankhamun. Picture this. A humble Egyptian boy, bringing water to workers at a desert excavation site. He stops to rest, stumbles on a stone, which turns out to be the first step of the most famous tomb in Egypt, that of Tutankhamun. Sounds like a movie scene, right? And for decades, it was treated as one. The problem? That story is pure fiction, invented by none other than the discoverer himself, Howard Carter. In 1922, Carter uncovered the untouched tomb of the young pharaoh, one of the most astonishing archaeological finds in history. But he also realized something. The discovery had to be as legendary in the media as it was in reality. It was the perfect moment to craft a magical tale, and the so-called water boy, young, innocent, and stumbling upon treasure by accident, was the romantic touch that sealed the legend. The story was so well constructed that it made its way into academic books. And not only that, over the years, the family of Abd el-Rasul, son of an Egyptian foreman, attempted to claim the role of the boy, capitalizing on the story's appeal, but Abd himself never confirmed it. The truth is, no boy stumbled upon anything. The discovery was meticulous, deliberate, and the result of years of systematic excavation. This myth shows how our desire for a compelling narrative can easily overshadow the truth. It turns a technical achievement, a precise excavation, into a fable of luck, simplicity, and fate. And of course, that appeals to the public. After all, who doesn't love the idea that something so grand was discovered by accident? But it also reveals something deeper. Even archaeology, a science rooted in physical evidence, can be wrapped in layers of fiction. And when that fiction comes from an authority figure like Carter, It gains weight and becomes entrenched. In the end, the story of the water boy doesn't directly diminish the importance of the discovery, but it distorts how we understand the historical process, replacing effort and method with a charming fairy tale. And that has consequences, because when we repeat stories like this uncritically, we leave the door open for other myths to take root in place of truth. The tomb of Tutankhamun is real, the water boy is not. And yet, it's the invented boy who continues to be remembered, cited, immortalized, because once again, myth has triumphed over reality. Polish cavalry versus German tanks. You've probably seen the image in books or films. Polish soldiers on horseback, sabers drawn, galloping heroically toward German tanks during the 1939 invasion of Poland. It's a powerful and tragic image, one that evokes both bravery and perhaps a hint of absurdity, but it's also a major distortion of the facts, and at its core, a carefully crafted piece of propaganda. The real story is quite different. While Poland did maintain cavalry units, it was far from the primitive or ill-prepared nation the myth suggests. It had tanks, an air force, and military strategies on par with the standards of the time. The mounted units, known as uhlans, were used tactically, for reconnaissance, rapid movement, and flanking maneuvers. They were not sent charging head-on into armored vehicles like medieval knights against iron giants. The event that sparked the myth occurred at Krojanty, where the 18th Uhlan Regiment launched a surprise attack on German infantry in a clearing. The strike was effective, it dispersed enemy troops, but soon after, German tanks arrived, forcing the Poles to retreat. From there, Nazi and later Soviet propaganda twisted the scene, portraying it as a suicidal cavalry charge against tanks. The goal was clear. For the Nazis, it showcased the supposed technological superiority of the Third Reich. For the Soviets, it painted Poland as a weak, outdated state, a convenient justification for both their invasion and eventual domination. It was a useful myth, and, like all emotionally charged myths, it spread quickly. What's most curious is that many people still believe it today. It's repeated in documentaries, textbooks, and even political speeches, sometimes as a symbol of bravery, sometimes as a cautionary tale of foolishness. That's the power of narrative. A simple, vivid image, with a touch of tragedy and heroism, carries more weight than pages of detailed explanation. That's the danger of so-called micro-myths. Small false stories that fit so neatly into preconceived worldviews that no one bothers to question them. And in this case, the micro-myth helped shape the perception of an entire nation, reducing its resistance to a caricature. Poland's true courage was overshadowed by a convenient stereotype. But now you know, there was no cavalry charge against tanks. There was a tactical strike against infantry, distorted, manipulated, and immortalized as if it were a scene from a tragic farce. A clear reminder that in times of war, the first casualty is always the truth. Hitler's dance. There's a scene widely spread in popular culture. Adolf Hitler, euphoric, almost dancing with joy upon hearing of France's surrender in 1940. Little jumps, swinging arms, a sinister grin on his face. It's a moment repeated as if it were fact, a symbolic portrait of Nazi arrogance at its peak. But that dance never happened. There is no reliable record, not in video, photo, or direct testimony, confirming that Hitler ever actually danced. Yes, he was pleased with the victory, as any military leader might be in a decisive moment, but the so-called dance? Most likely an invention, or at best an exaggerated interpretation of a fleeting gesture, a misstep, an involuntary hop, a misleading camera angle, and the propaganda machine did the rest. In fact, the image gained traction through edits and montages, especially by the Allies, who were keen to ridicule Hitler's figure. Portraying the great dictator hopping like a spoiled child was an effective way to dehumanize him, to reduce his threat to something almost comical. The dance became a meme before the internet ever existed, but this false portrayal endured for a simple reason. It worked. It encapsulated the image of a megalomaniac villain, out of touch with reality, foolishly celebrating someone else's suffering. It was visually striking, emotionally satisfying, and therefore, easy to spread. Which shows that it's not always facts that shape collective memory, but the emotions those facts evoke. This kind of micro-myth is dangerous because, although it may seem harmless, it shapes how we understand historical figures and events. It transforms what could be a sober analysis of Nazi politics and wartime strategies into an emotional caricature, And when we reduce a regime like the Third Reich to absurd gestures, we risk losing sight of the real and horrifying complexity it embodied. The idea of Hitler dancing is powerful because it reinforces a sense of poetic justice, the villain at the height of his arrogance in a moment that foreshadows his downfall. Narratively perfect, historically flimsy, there's no footage, no photo, just collective memory, molded by decades of repetition. In the end, this dance is yet another reminder that historical narratives are not shaped by facts alone, but by how we want to remember them. And in this case, we prefer a ridiculous Hitler to a real one, which says a lot about us.